Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Hello. Hi. My name's Madeline Grinstein, and I want to welcome you to this afternoon's event. Before we get into this conversation, a reminder to please silence or turn off your phones, unless, of course, you're using it for captioning. Thank you to all the generous founders for making this program and exhibition possible. I appreciate that. That is your eye chart, so I won't be going through it. This afternoon, we are thrilled to host the opening roundtable on Thinking and Being Caribbean as part of the exhibition Forecast Form, Art in the Caribbean Diaspora 1990s to Today, a show magnificently curated by Carla Acevedo Yates, Marilyn and Larry Fields curator, with the able assistance of curatorial assistant Iris Colburn, former Sussman curatorial fellow Isabel Casso, and current Sussman curatorial fellow Nolan Jimbo. This is the first, yes, round of applause for these guys. This is the first major group exhibition in the United States to envision a new approach to contemporary art of the Caribbean diaspora that centers the Caribbean as a bellwether for our rapidly shifting times. Para aquellos de ustedes que prefieren hablar español, buenas tardes, les damos la bienvenida y nos alegra que están aquí. Mi nombre es Madeline Grinstein, soy la directora del museo. Y este museo va a estar totalmente bilingüe en todas sus comunicaciones, incluidos declaraciones como estas, en los próximos 2 años. So, yes. Estamos orgullosos de ser el único museo de arte contemporáneo en esta nación que se compromete con esta inclusión particular para nuestro público que prefiere el español. Para mí personalmente, como alguien que nació y se crió en América Latina, este es un punto particular de orgullo institucional. Y por esto quiero agradecer a mis colegas, en particular Laura Herrera, nuestra directora de comunicación y su increíble equipo. Y por supuesto a nuestro curador en jefe René Morales, que está aquí hoy día, y la magnífica Carla Acevedo Yates por participar en este esfuerzo. Muchas gracias. Antes de comenzar la conversación, por favor, apaguen sus teléfonos a menos que los están usando para subtitular. The Forecast Form exhibition is part of a larger effort at the MCA to support Latinx, Latin American, and Caribbean artists. Most recently, the MCA was a recipient of a major grant from the Mellon Foundation to support this work across exhibitions, acquisitions, programs, and importantly, transitioning ourselves to a bilingual Spanish-English institution within the next 2 years. In line with this, for those of you online, real-time Spanish translations are available on Zoom. And as you can see, as you will see, we have in-person live captioning in Spanish and English. Esta tarde estamos encantados de presentar la mesa redonda de apertura sobre el pensamiento y el ser caribeño por la exposición Forecast Form, curada por Carla Acevedo Yates con la asistencia de Iris Colburn, Isabel Casso y Nolan Jimbo. Es la primera exposición colectiva en los Estados Unidos que imagina un nuevo enfoque del arte contemporáneo en la diáspora caribeña, poniendo en primer plano formas que revelan nuestros nuevos modos de pensar sobre la identidad y el lugar para entender el Caribe como un indicador de nuestros tiempos rápidamente cambiantes. La exposición es parte de nuestros esfuerzos más grandes para apoyar a los artistas latinos y caribeños. Más recientemente, la MCA recibió una subvención clave de la Fundación Mellon para apoyar este trabajo en toda la organización, incluido exhibiciones y programas. En línea con esto, para este programa, las traducciones en línea en español están disponibles en Zoom y, como pueden ver, tenemos subtítulos en vivo en persona en español e inglés. This afternoon's program features 3 voices from Forecast Form: María Magdalena Campos Pons, Chris Cozier, and Teresita Fernandez, in conversation with Carla. To name just a couple of distinguished honors held by these artists, Magdalena's works are held in the collections of over 50 museums worldwide, and she is currently chair of the Fine Arts Department at Vanderbilt University. Chris has exhibited in many international exhibitions, including the 2021 Liverpool Biennial, the 2019 Sharjah Biennial, as well as co-directing Alice Yard, a contemporary art space and collective in Trinidad that participated in the most recent Documenta. And Teresita is a 2005 MacArthur Foundation Fellow, appointed by President Obama to be the first Latina to serve on the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, in addition to a long and marvelous history of exhibitions and museum collection holdings. El programa de esta tarde presenta tres voces de Forecast Forum: María Magdalena Campos Pons, Chris Cogier y Teresita Fernández, en conversación con Carla. Por favor, darles la bienvenida a estos grandes artistas. Please join me in welcoming everyone to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming out in this chilly winter day. I hope you're keeping warm. I'm absolutely honored to share the stage with Teresita Fernandez, Christopher Cozier, and Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, who's joining us from Nashville in Zoom. Three artists whose powerful works are featured in Forecast Forum. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak with us today. So as part of the book, the catalog for Forecast Forum, Teresita, Magda, and I met over Zoom last year on September 27th to discuss a very simple question. What is the Caribbean, and what does Caribbean mean for you and your work? The conversation was rich and complex, and we agreed that we needed to do it again, and alas, here we are. But before we dive into some of those questions here with all of you, I wanted to speak about the conceptual framework of the exhibition, how it was installed, which might shed some light on some of these questions. And something that it's really important for me is that the show has a beginning and end. And if you haven't seen the show, I invite you to go to the 4th floor. It opened today to the public. And one thing I realized was that I thought that there was one particular beginning and one end, but you can enter from either side of the space, which was really interesting to realize once the show was open. Another important element in the galleries is that the show starts with video and photography, and that is very deliberate in the sense of how light and photography in particular as a medium has been instrumental in the construction of its imaginary, or the fantasy of what the Caribbean is. This, of course, has been researched at length and theorized as the Caribbean picturesque by art historian Krista Thompson, who has been extremely influential for me and my work and many other curators in the region and in the United States, of course, of how art from the Caribbean has been historically framed, displayed, and interpreted. Related to this, and light, the installation of the show itself is structured around concepts of light and shadow. And of course, this has been achieved by careful lighting, and for that I have to thank my colleague Ty Weberhurst and his team. And this duality can be seen in several works in the show, conceptually, starting with Álvaro Barrios' incredible work, El Mar de Cristóbal Colón, the Sea of Christopher Columbus, that you can see in the atrium and across the museum. I invite you to see it. It's an incredible work that speaks about the contradictions between beauty and violence. The Sea of Christopher Columbus, of course, one side is blue as you encounter it from one side of the exhibition, and as you navigate it, you encounter the red part of the silk screens, which, of course, talk about the violence of colonialism. So through the show, I wanted to take visitors through these contradictions of light and shadow, a space of encountering this duality. So through this journey, I think that it also relates to the ideas of the shore, or even the horizon line, as a space of intersection, as a space of in-between. You can see that formally in the works of Celia Sanchez, Deborah Jack, Ana Mendieta, and of course in your work, Chris, where the horizon line is featured very prominently. And more nuanced in the work of Felix González Torres, Engel Leonardo, Sandra Brewster, Cosmo White. I can continue on, and many others in the exhibition. So in the roundtable, the first question was, what is the Caribbean, to both you, Teresita, and Magda? And we ended up talking about the shoreline in particular as a space that was significant to all of you. So I wanted to start with you, Teresita, to talk about how the shore as a space of intersection, of duality, has been important for you to think about Caribbeanness and how it relates to how you approach materials and how you approach your work.
Thank you for the exhibition, first of all, before we start. I think that there's so many interesting entry points for this, and I think that beginning with the shoreline is not so different than beginning with the idea of light and dark, or light and shadow. And I've always been really interested in those sort of saccadic efforts of the eye, this idea that all of the interesting things actually reside between these binaries, right, between these poles. And it's been a premise, that idea of something that's constantly shifting and forcing you to reposition yourself in order to see something. And I use the word see, physically, but also metaphorically, to understand something, has been really central to how I, conceptualize my work. The sense that in those in-between spaces is where it is that all of the information that has been hidden resides. And so this notion, I've always thought of these degrees of not seeing, these poles of sort of visibility or invisibility, which is also what the shore does, right? It reveals and it conceals over and over again, sort of in this perpetual motion. I've always been really interested in how what is revealed or what is hidden is sort of like degrees of seeing and not seeing, but less having to do with the physicality of the eye as a seeing mechanism, and more having to do with dreaming and imagining and myth making, and how it is that we construct images in our mind's eye, which is, of course, informs what it is that we think we see much more than what we are seeing in front of us in some kind of fixed way. And in relation to the Caribbean, it's especially relevant, it's especially apropos to start with this sort of question, because I also think that that is how the Caribbean has been hidden, and also how it's been manipulated and distorted in terms of something that comes into view within certain narratives and then disappears in others. And thinking about that has been really central to how I imagine, how I construct ideas, basically, and even just the notion of how we always separate land and water, how the Caribbean and lots of other archipelagic entities are easy to hide because they're referred to as small, or as periphery, and how that narrative, which is about visibility and invisibility, is always told in relation to continental dominance and to size, which is what happens when you separate land from water. If you talk to a Marshallese person, they would tell you that their country is not small, because of course the land and the water are connected. And so the shoreline, I think, is that very poetic image that weaves together this idea of seeing and not seeing in a way that resists the poles and the binary, but that also resists being named or fixed. And I think that that's a really powerful metaphor.
Yeah, and also Magda, during that conversation, that was so incredible. If you haven't gotten hands on this book, please start with the Roundtable conversation. It's really, really inspiring, and there's so many interesting tidbits that I want to dig into. Maybe we won't have time today, but Magda, you really approach the Caribbean in a more embodied way, in the sense of of being profoundly evocative of the body, and in particular, you talk about the Caribbean as a state of being without borders, as the body performing in relation to a particular set of sites and events. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about what that shoreline means to you, in the sense of the changing and shifting tides that might signify a being without borders, and how that relates to the body.
I forgot that I was on Zoom for a minute. I was so entranced with what Teresita say that I was imagining that I was there. But I want to say, I want to say thank you to you, Carla, for the vision and making this exhibition. Your team, the director of the museum, everybody that has been involved in this making of this. What I would say, I haven't seen the show yet, but just knowing the list of artists, a visionary exhibition. Uh, I was absolutely enthralled in what Teresita described in her own approach. And while she was speaking, I was just making a line. And for me, I was imagining what I may going to call the instability of the destination. And thinking in the Caribbean of this place in which going and arriving has been always punctuated by incredible moment of violence and distortion of the permanency of the body. Uh, Being a Black woman in the Caribbean, you cannot imagine the metaphor or actually the geography, physical of the shoreline without thinking in arriving and departure. And the implication of arriving of departure always connecting with incredible uprooting of the experience of bodies in geographies and what these geographies represent. As I was thinking of this particular conversation, I was imagining uh, the Caribbean not only as this moment of geography that had been punctuated or punctured by the passing of the sea and existing as a uprooting presence of body of land, but also the stories that have been constructed there, because the historical position of the Caribbean as a space of negotiation, space of arrival, a space of extracting, space of juxtaposition of narrative that has been quite complex for the experience of the body itself. And what I say, the performativity of the Caribbean body. There is a beautiful line by a Cuban singer of sort of a little older than my generation, but very present in my generation, that say, soy el Caribe, no soy tierra firme. Or he speak about both being in the Caribbean and really having a struggling moments, accepting and understanding the continental shore and the continental mass. So this position from in the Caribbean, in which you feel both the vulnerability of more stable grounds, let's call that continental mass, but also the fragility of what your borders are, not only geographical, but physical, intellectual. It is in the Caribbean, in which we witness a sort of a melange, of a sort of a very intriguing risk-taking of colliding cultures together, colliding dreams together, that doesn't repeat very easily in continental other part of over the small island Earth. But I think that the Caribbean itself create an imaginary location of juxtaposition, interpolations, and coalescing of moments that construct very particular experience of the body. As we talk, there are people trying to touch the other side of what I call this unstable destination, going from the Caribbean to someplace, some else. In my own work, when I am thinking of a piece of, for instance, dreaming of an island in which the woman is in the shore of maybe the Caribbean, but the destination is a landscape that doesn't necessarily exist in any place. It's a metaphor. And I am thinking that that too is an important condition, this existing in metaphor, existing in a space of imagination for the Caribbean being and for the Caribbean body. That's what I would think that maybe it's an approximation to your question.
And Chris, to you, the shore also plays an important part in your work and how you're thinking about ideas around exchange, but also in the work in the show, Gasman. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about how this project came about, because it was actually filmed here in Lake Michigan while you were doing a residency at Northwestern. So you want to talk a little bit about why was it important for you to film that project on the shores of Lake Michigan, and how does that image translate now when you show that, for example, here or even in Trinidad or in other places?
Yeah, okay, sure. And thanks, Carla, for putting this project together and for initiating this discussion. And thanks to the audience for being willing to listen to us. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, when you grow up in an island, the shore is always there, according to the size of the island, of course. And the shore is a kind of unfathomable thing, as everybody has talked about, departures, the tide coming and going, the shifting tide. I mean, for me, on a very personal level, I mean, some of my earliest memories were just of being in water and looking out and wondering what is out there in that unfathomable space, Because when people think of islands, they think of you think of the little landmass. But in the Caribbean, many of these islands, their maritime borders are quite, much larger than the islands themselves. And then maybe there's just one sea out there, because I was reading some material recently about the attempt to divide the oceans of the planet. Like, there's probably just one ocean, but they try to use a kind of land-driven, subdivision. So in a lot of my work, I think I'm always watching the shore. So when I was at Northwestern on a residency initiated by Krista Thompson, I was walking along Lake Michigan quite a lot. And I thought, one of the things I think about when I'm at the beach since I was a kid is that the beach all time happens at the same time on the beach. Because the beach is where different things happen. It could be people lying down getting a tan. It could be somebody launching a ship to Yemaya. It could be the mouth of a river. It could be where a battle was fought 100 years ago, or more recently. There was a Great Day invasion and other things like that. It could be smugglers bringing drugs. It could be fishermen pulling nets. So you sit there, and it could be a very beautiful day, and somebody could drown. So there's a kind of a way in which the beach is always a space of multiple associative things. So while walking along Lake Michigan, I can't remember what madness took me, but I was thinking about the fact that in the 18th century, the Caribbean was a dangerous place. Sugar was the global addiction. And, so things could happen to you, And I was reading a lot. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that Trinidad was one of the first places in the world that people extracted oil out of the ground, the Brits. And I was thinking that the parts of the world where the smoke is rising are the parts of the world that are associated with the current addiction. So I kind of there's all kinds of myriad stories. So I just said, what if I brought some guys on the beach with some gas nozzles? And, because the space also was confusing to me, because it looked, if you're walking on Lake Michigan and you're watching the water, it looks like any beach anywhere in the world, even if it's cold as ass, right? And then suddenly, I realized, no, it's cold. We're not at a tropical beach, but it's a beach. And so I think it's like, just as I talked about all of these associations, like all shorelines are kind of one shoreline, one space in my mind to imagine something that's unfathomable, that, you take flight. So that has been my experience since childhood. Kind of just floating in water and watching the sea. I don't know if that helps you. So that's how the project started. And now that it's here, what beach is it? What shoreline is it? Is it in the Gulf of Mexico? Is it, Eden? Where is it? Where men contest to grab pieces of land and territory. you know, and so that's kind of how the whole project started.
Why was it important for you to collaborate with the musicians and to use that particular sitar sound?
Yeah, well, already we are kind of dealing with a confusion of geography, right? We don't know where we are, but we know where we are, right? Everybody can say it's my space, right? And so when I shot it, I had the raw footage and I didn't know what to do with it. I was just thinking, okay, this is a kind of B-movie masculine spectacle or something like that. And then I had to go home for a wedding, and these performers were two musicians that I knew had a performance, and I listened to it, and it was a kind of a jazz singer with a sitarist. And I said, oh, maybe I'll play around with this. So I said Bollywood style. I showed the raw footage, and they actually played live. And one of the best moments was an ambulance went by while we were recording, because we were recording outdoors. And I kind of said to them, no, leave it. You know, so I got the ambient song. And then I began to realize that it kind of confused location again, because, you know, people often don't associate, you know, people's understanding of the Caribbean is often very narrow, you know, and the Caribbean is a place where it has, as I say, it's one ocean, right? So for some people, it's the Black Water. For some people, it's the Middle Passage, you know? So there's all these movements. And if you think about the Caribbean in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, the migration into the Caribbean, well, especially in the context of Trinidad, where I'm from, it's been mostly people coming from the conflicts in Syria, the sort of unresolved issues in Venezuela. So even though when we think of the Caribbean, we think of the Middle Passage, nobody talks about the more recent conflicts and shifts, you know? So I was thinking about that as well. Yeah.
So going back to you, Teresita, the work that you're showing in the exhibition, Rising Lynch Land, is part of like a body of work that is addressing the Caribbean more directly, and it's a bit of a departure from your previous work. And I know that for you was really important Glissant's essay, The Black Beach, and where the shoreline also plays an important, it's like an image, like, or a metaphor for this wandering person. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to address the Caribbean in that way, and why was this essay so important for you in this new body of work that you started?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, and riffing too off of what both Magda and Chris have touched upon, this I wanted to just like answer that question, talking about how the idea that places actually also resides inside of us and not always outside as a physical phenomenon, and that sometimes in the way that Chris just said, where the Caribbean is sort of contextualized with one particular moment or pivot. It's also sometimes never seen as an ancient place, which I think is really interesting. And I want to talk about Rising Lynch Land, but I also want to say that I once found a shell in the desert in the Southwest. And it made me think very differently of this idea that what we think of as even land or water, yes, the water is always connected to the biggest colonized piece of land that's next to it, right? But that at one point, and I think it's really important to think about this in relation to climate change as well, because all of those lines are changing very, very rapidly in real time. That what we think of as like an island in the Caribbean rather than like a holistic thing is actually just part of something much greater that you can't see. And that finding that shell in the desert reminded me that even the construct of what we allocate as land or water has much more to do with how we position ourselves with a kind of wayfinding project where we're constantly having to reposition where we are in order to understand who we are and who we are in relation to one another. And that's what identifying place is really about. And I think that Glissant's essay so poetically, and I think a lot of people have very recently sort of discovered Glissant and a lot of other intellectual Caribbean thinkers like Sylvia Wynter or even like Derek Walcott or even Lezama Lima, and like there's so much erasure around the history of Caribbean intellectuals. And so it's very funny also to sort of see the art world discover an essay by Glisson and then kind of sell back to artists the same thing that maybe those of us who have like a more direct connection to the Caribbean may have always known about. So Rising Lynched Land is a piece that I made. I wanted to somehow find a way, and it was a very challenging piece for me to make because there was a kind of somberness and a kind of sadness that touched upon both the violence of colonization and the enslavement of African peoples and the decimation of indigenous peoples, but also how that's reflected and paralleled in the land itself and in the water around the land. And so I had this idea of what it would be to anthropomorphize an element of the landscape and to suspend it. And the piece I really grappled with not just whether to make it, but how to make it. And so one of the things that was really important to me was that I wanted to make it in a way that was really exquisite, because some of the things that it was trying to do was to, negotiate this like redemptive possibility that emerged from this sort of like very problematic and very sort of like heavy subject matter that had to do more with the violence. And so the piece was made in like a really crazy way. Like the engineering on it is really kind of insane. It was made 10 times in a way that was 10 times more complex than it needed to be made. And in part it was because as I made it, I was familiarizing myself with it. I was touching it, and to speak to Magda's earlier comment, that kind of like tactile, somatic sort of understanding of something. I burned the trunk on it. Each little, patina, the top is made out of copper. And so there was a kind of care with which it was put together. The way that the rope is attached, the way the burlap is treated, that maybe is invisible to the public, which was about a kind of handling of the piece that, and treating it almost like a body, so that there was a kind of relationship to it and a reciprocity. And that notion that, the idea of the landscape, or in this case, this palm tree, is not just something that's sort of like looked at in this iconic way and used as this sort of empty symbol, this cliche symbol, but that in a certain way that it also looks back at you, that you're in the landscape, but it's also inside of you. And it's not just that you're sort of occupying the landscape as this sort of character on the stage, but that you're of it and that you're in it, and that same water that we're referring to is also the water in our bodies, sort of rising and falling in those same cycles. So that's what I was trying to do, is to create a piece that did both, that could somehow live in this very particular tone between the violence and the sort of beauty, the sort of like redemptive beauty that was suspended. So the fact that it sort of floats above the floor is really important, and the fact that it's rising rather than hanging is also important.
Something that I discovered during the opening, we were talking underneath your beautiful piece, is that the palm fronds are like knives, are sharpened knives, and that really impacted me, because like as I'm seeing the show, I'm discovering so many more connections between your work and other works that are adjacent to yours. And I was thinking of your work, Magda, Sugar Bittersweet, which is very near Teresita's work, and these like Yoruba spears that are kind of this landscape. And I want you to talk a little bit about this piece, because in a way, it's like this material repository of your own biography, but it also speaks to a very personal history, but also the history of the Caribbean more broadly. Can you talk a little bit about the concept of the piece and how it relates directly to your background and your identity.
Sugar bittersweet. It's really when I started doing that piece, I was thinking fundamentally in a very early experience in my life, growing up in a sugar plantation in the province of Matanzas in Cuba, and walking through a sugarcane field. So I arranged the piece in a grid, and with the perfection of the grid, they have a very well designed economical sugar field. There is a cruelty in both the labor of sugar, as there is a cruelty in the map of the trade ship, in which all the perfection of the alignment of the body for assurance of how many body you could carry. Same with the sugar field. There is a way distance between them. And the original installation of the piece, Carla, was intended, which I love that you have it in this way. I am really enamored of the way that you install the piece. But you could walk through the lines like you do in a sugar field. In sinking in the expansive line of the Caribbean, and in this particular piece, I spoke with many people about the experience about sugar production, consumption of sugar, the fact that I dislike anything that is sugary, personally. And I remember a conversation with a Brazilian individual who described to me how in the early days of the morning when the harvesting of sugar is performed in all over the Caribbean, when the light of the sun in the Caribbean is a straight ray to the land, sometimes the blade of the grass of the sugar cane cut through the eyes of the cortadores de cañas, the harvesters, and many people will become blind harvesting sugar. As I said that, this image now, and as when I hear it for the first time, it really goes through my body as a physical experience that the production of sugar was over and over and over, almost a process of annihilation, mutilating, degrading the black body. So when I did the sugar beaten sweet and the elements that are in there, both the spears that are part of the installation, most of them are spears of African origin that I collect over the years as I was thinking in that piece. And I think of them almost as referring metaphorically to the blades of the tall grass that is cane, sugar cane, and the kind of a dangerous and always impending tragedy that is permanent in the sugar field. I remember as a young girl going in the sugar field and being hurt by the proximity of the edges of the leaf. So this piece is as much as a cry for these stories of pain inflicted in the body, but also this kind of redemptive power of a place of resistance as well, and a place of liberation. This spear is told looking up with the possibility of a point of going toward an elevation that doesn't end. And I choose very carefully every one of these stools. Some of them are African, most of them Western African, and some of them Chinese, because I wanted to include in this personal history as well the presence of the labor of a Chinese origin in the trade and in the whole industry of sugar and tobacco as well, but in sugar in Cuba, and also in my family history when they were people coming from China and working as well in the field. So I think that is, as I say again, I think that the title is in some way descriptive: sugar, bitter, and sweetness, and trying to emphasize the moment of a change between these two polarities and this kind of complexity of the production, the harvesting, and maybe a permanent present for the terrifying presence of the sugar field. One more scene, as I follow in when Teresita was mentioned about the ecological impact. For the island of Cuba, sugar production was a decimation of the entire original ecological and arboreal presence of the islands. Cuba was decimated over and over and over, turned from a very vibrant and green country with an incredible variety of trees and plants into a monoculture from colonial period to very recent that literally erased the history and the historical, would say, but also a tradition of original native species of the island and of the territory itself.
Thank you, Magda. I want to pivot and talk about some broader questions to all of you. There's some things that have come up during this conversation that also came up during our roundtable, our Zoom roundtable. One of them is this idea of performativity or performance. It feels like there's a lot of artists like from the Caribbean or connected to the region that feel some type of pressure to perform Caribbeanness, and we've discussed that. So we've discussed that a lot and with a lot of artists in the show, actually. So I'm wondering if either any of you can talk about this or talk to this, about that pressure to perform Caribbeanness within certain contexts. Chris, would you like to start?
I mean, that's what the Caribbean is about, especially at the juncture of exchange. In the early kind of era of expeditions and so on, people changed the maps, to make them look like what they came looking for so they could get more money, right? So there's a kind of way in which the Caribbean is always like this kind of malleable thing that part of a kind of marketing proposal that is kind of linked to the expeditionary enterprise. And so very often Caribbean people are often sitting at that juncture, we live in a different period now, but if you look back, say like in the past, you see these kind of gestures, of performance, I think in the talk, I referred to, I found a really beautiful piece of archival footage where a very famous Caribbean artist in the 40s or 50s is doing a performance in a nightclub in England. And he's doing an African voodoo dance, and there's people sitting down having cocktails, smoking cigarettes and clapping, and he's kind of doing this performance. And you realize, even though it seems somewhat demeaning, you kind of realize that everybody is benefiting from this exchange. Everybody's getting what they want, So yes, it's something, but I think as institutional and curatorial enterprises change, the requirement to sort of perform that is maybe shifting, or hopefully for the better. And I'm hoping this show is one of those enterprises where we could sort of deal more with the process and the kind of the sort of experiment or the kind of investigations that as we try to understand ourselves in relation to the world and be less trapped in the kind of older narrative of performing something for the institution to gain visibility and resources. I think Derek Walcott has a play about that, actually, pantomime, where it's a guy bringing cocktails for a guy in a hotel, and then there's some reversals too, who has power and who doesn't in that relationship, so.
I almost feel, and Teresita, forgive me if I jump in it, but I am almost want to think about the complicity of the performativity of the Caribbeanness, the desire, the hunger, and the implication of almost I almost feel like it would be the rabbit and a carrot. There is something there, putting the stick there with this idea. What is if I reverse the view and I say it from a position of defiant? Do I am able and ready to refuse the performativity of the, let's say, as a possibility of the European view? Let's say to establish as the of the accepting canon, the one that requests and requires certain behavior, presentation, decor, and decorum as well, that signify or indicate, maybe I say European to say an example of how he had been juxtaposed and in some way pulled the tension. For once, for instance, Carla, I would like to be considered before I left the planet in this physical form, in which, by the way, today I am performing Caribbeanness with my sun orange drench and my hairpiece, which is so much part of how my grandmother, my aunt, my all the women, my ancestors were. But it could be seen as that. And I am thinking that for once, for instance, I want to have the privilege to be thinking as artists, contemporary or no. Once at some point we could pass the restrictions of what I say, the determination of the body in geography. What it means, and this is what I love, your show, I haven't seen it yet, but the complexity of the show, what it means to be Caribbean in Germany, in Denmark, in France, in Berlin, or in China. What is that? What does mean? And how that it imply for us the permission to really explore and trying to understand what it is to be Caribbean. What is Caribbean? What is Caribbean? What it means for me? I lived in Boston for 30 years. Still, I miss the sunshine, but my body and my blood become completely adapted and working in the conditions of this other geography. For that reason, I love your early question about, or your showed proposal, not only being Caribbean, but what is thinking of being Caribbean? What does mean? I don't have an answer, honestly, but I am thinking that is a very complex, thin line that is almost like it's always uneven and is a little bit dangerous almost. And that's what I say in the beginning, or I am thinking in the beginning, the instability of the destination. For me, as a Caribbean artist, what is my aspiration of desire? To become what? As an artist, a universal artist, I don't know what is the term, a contemporary artist, or just a valuable thinker, maker with certain touch of experience that is built so much to back to Teresita in an interior mood that is not just easy visible in how we once decorate or one literary even perform. And I was thinking back to Teresita. Teresita, I think that the talk that you could have talked and I missed just listen. But Lesama Lima, such a profound Caribbean artist and so rooted in so other geography without even leaving the shore. He is an extraordinary example of this incredible inner self, inner life, inner spirit, inner energy that bursts out of the Caribbean. And like him, others. I am thinking Eliseo Diego. And when you talk about luces and sombras, shadows and light, if you read Eliseo Diego in La Calzada de Jesús del Monte, And you see how this man described the life that happened in the Caribbean at a certain time, or Alejo Carpentier. This is a very, very complex proposition and very complex place. And I want again, and this opportunity, and thank you for the privilege to have this conversation here, what it is the opposite of being performing Caribbean. Could I dare to say performing Europeanness? Is that possible, and what that means?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's part of this idea also of regionality that I'm trying to address in the show. And something that I've been thinking a lot about is, people talk about regional shows in the US, but all the shows here are regional. The Whitney Biennial is a regional show, MoMA, all of those shows are regional, right? Why do we have to be in those regional shows? But something that I wanted to go back to in the sense of performing Caribbeanness is the role of abstraction. Because in the show, deliberately, there's a lot of artists deploying abstraction, very deliberately so, as a way to play with ideas of legibility and illegibility. And in your case, Teresita, that's something that you have used throughout your career, very much so. And in the Roundtable, you talk about Feliz González Torres, and you talk about abstraction as a safe space, as a place where you can perhaps say what you cannot say, the unutterable. That's what you talk about. Can you address that directly? Because I think that has to do with this idea of legibility, of representation, and also of a type of Caribbeanness that refuses to be legible, that refuses to be defined.
Yeah, so I think that, violence takes on lots of different ways. And it takes on a simultaneity. And so what was so interesting, and in this case I'm talking about sort of the violence of not being able to see something. It was such an interesting moment when we were all on that Zoom call doing the Roundtable. And we were just firing off, everybody was just on. It was very dynamic. And to hear both Chris and Magda talk about, the sort of ridiculousness of performing Caribbeanness and the sort of need for a consumption of that and a demand for that. And as I was listening to them, I realized that the flip side of that, which is an equally sort of problematic counterpoint, is that if you are an artist of Caribbean descent living in the United States, right, you are basically rewarded for performing Donald Juddness or performing Smithsonness or performing, fill in the blank, right? And if you're any artist of my generation, right, where you're kind of replicating these imposed canons as though they are fact. And so for me, Felix is a really important person. I really believed, can we not imagine that Felix González Torres' work, how could it not be Caribbean, right? It's so quintessentially Caribbean, and yet it performs nothing for anybody. And I often think of that last interview of Jack Whitten when he is highly criticized for not making representations of Black bodies at the height of the civil rights movement. And he looks straight at the camera and he says, "I know it's in there because I put it in there." And it's a very powerful moment, because what you were talking about, Magda, this idea that something resides inside of you, what Lizama Lima and Jose Marti talk about so brilliantly, that luz propia, that allows you to know who you are with agency, regardless of or in spite of all of the things that tell you that you can make an image or that you can't make an image, were really important for me. And there was a kind of moment where, when I did the Maelstrom show in New York, and the visual essay that went along with it, that was a way of feeling like I didn't have to hide anymore. And I see what has happened with Felix's work posthumously, and even Ana Mendieta's work, where the longer he's been gone, more of a white gay man he has become rather than an immigrant. You know, Felix arrived in this country as a grown man. He studied in Puerto Rico. He spoke with a thick accent. And so he's somehow now posthumously just associated with, AIDS epidemic and the history of gay white men, and he's sort of like been positioned. His entire legacy has been shaped posthumously. And so the abstraction which he used as a safe space to be able to hide, in my opinion, his Caribbeanness amongst many other things, is something that was also used against him, I think, has been used against him. And when they did that piece, I thought, can I do this? This is such the challenge was that the palm tree was such a cliche, and that the cliche of the Caribbean is always twofold, and you only have two choices, right? Because they're the two flip sides of this violence that erases both poles, which is either the poverty that stems from colonization over here, or island paradise over here. Those were the two choices in terms of the cliches with which the iconography around the Caribbean is sort of held. And so to make that palm tree was a sort of, it was like that Jack Whitten moment. It was like, no, I know what I'm doing here. And to do it with full agency in a way that didn't require a kind of validation or a kind of being turned into a caricature of something, was, I think, what the piece is precisely about. It's the what does it mean, and what would have happened if Felix wouldn't have died, or if Anna wouldn't have died? Because I feel like it's very convenient that the sort of, there's an impulse, right? And so for me, it wasn't the pressure to perform Caribbeanness like it was for both of you. It was actually the pressure to deny Caribbeanness, right? And to assimilate into a kind of very, Eurocentric and very American understanding of history, which for me just, quite frankly, didn't work out. And so when a lot of these histories are told, starting from 1619, from the history and the point of view of the British colonies, and I look at like Havana, founded in 1519, which is where my family's from, I'm like, there's over 100 years missing here. So it was a way of doing, it was a way of somehow rectifying that internally too, as a way of repositioning myself internally, and perhaps in ways that are invisible and not necessary to explain.
But I think, I don't know if my mic is on. I think that denial that you're talking about, that erasure, the denial is of a very particular type of Caribbeanness. It's that gaze that is imposed upon us, right? Because I do feel that abstraction is very Caribbean, right?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
And then why is the fact that that type of manifestation is so denied, or is not available to us, or it has to be minimalist, for example? I mean, there's so much about the reading of certain artists that are trying to place it within a very particular type of art historical narrative. For example, Felix, Celia Sanchez is another artist, for example, when I think that her abstraction really comes from another place. It comes from that opacity, right, that Glissant speaks about. But I think that if we don't have any more comments, we can probably open it up to the floor for questions.
Hello, Nena Torres. What I'd like to, sort of a comment and a question for all of you, including you, Carla. The Caribbean, maybe we can imagine it from the United States and not necessarily from the Caribbean, to the extent, for instance, those of us who study ideas of the Caribbean, we're struck by the divisions between English-speaking Caribbean and Spanish-speaking Caribbean. For example, Enrique Patterson, a friend of Magda's as well, a black philosopher and a philosopher of race, was not in communications with Charles Mills, a philosopher of race from Jamaica, in part because of that the language division. So in constructing the show, is the question of diaspora what helps imagine the Caribbean, or is it that in visual arts maybe there's a little bit more communication?
I think the concept of diaspora helps me to think about the Caribbean as a place within all of its complexity, as opposed to other frameworks. And it helps me to think about also the type of artwork that is produced by artists that come from the Caribbean or have some connections to the Caribbean or have done work in the Caribbean or not of Caribbean descent. But those divisions are they're colonial structures. They're very, I would say, deliberately made so we don't talk to each other. And it's very, for example, it's very hard from Puerto Rico to travel to Trinidad. It's very expensive. It's easier to go to New York or to go to Miami. So there's certain, I would say, colonial and neo-colonial structures still in place that don't allow us to communicate, but that comes from a history of colonization. And I think that for me, diaspora is a moment where we can think about the constitution of the region more broadly as a place that was made by all of these different movements and exchanges. And I think that's kind of like at the crux of the exhibition, that helps me to think of something a little bit more broader, and to think of the Caribbean as this global place, right? I think that that's kind of like at the center of the show is this idea of the Caribbean, of global Caribbean or an expanded Caribbean. But I'm not sure maybe you guys have some comments about that?
I don't know. I mean, I want to just say something about the word global, because I've actually been using the word cosmic to talk about the Caribbean instead of global. I just did a talk in London with David Adjaye, and he often uses the word planetary to refer to architecture as a planetary practice. And I love this idea of imagining that the Caribbean is actually cosmic, and that a word like revolution is actually a cosmic term that points to something that revolves around a fixed point. And for me, that fixed point is Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. And I think it's so important to always go back to the Haitian Revolution. Certainly, like the history of Cuba can't be talked about without the Haitian Revolution. After the Haitian Revolution, slavery quadrupled in Cuba. And I think that for how we talk about these regions and, the understanding that geography in general is a colonial practice, it's important to focus on the things that did happen when we weren't forced to think of ourselves as different. And so the Haitian Revolution is what ignites, it's not just that the Haitians freed themselves, it's that they literally taught the rest of Latin America how to free itself. And that our, quote unquote, American notions of sovereignty or freedom are really shaped by this. They don't come from ancient Greece, even though that's what we're taught. They come from the Haitian Revolution, all our ideas of citizenship, of nationhood. And so I don't even think we can speak about the history of the United States without talking about the history of the Caribbean, and I don't think we can speak about the history of the Caribbean without going even further in this very sort of zooming into the Haitian Revolution, and how when you get to the Haitian Revolution, you are actually able to talk about the globe. And so going inwards in order to be able to zoom back out again. And that's a very Caribbean thing. This idea that the micro, that the intimate is nested inside of the immense, and that this is not a speck, an island, a little tiny place in the world, but that it's immense and that it's cosmic and that it's, all of these things that are, I think, bigger than global. They need a bigger word almost. We don't have it. Natalie Diaz often talks about how English is, that English fails us as a way of talking about these concepts. And so maybe we need another word that's bigger than cosmic, but yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm Ryan Jobson. Good to see you, Chris. I had a question about the way that the Caribbean unsettles taken for granted geographies. And I'm thinking about that in relation both to the shoreline and the sea, which have come up in this conversation. So first, I'm thinking about the shoreline and the way, particularly in a place like Guyana, for instance. Thank you. Walter Rodney talks about the way in which Guyanese people, particularly enslaved people in Guyana, were responsible for what he calls humanizing the landscape, for moving hundreds of tons of landfill to be able to settle the coast. And Chris, in your work along Lake Michigan, it also brings to mind the fact that everything sort of east of Michigan Avenue here in Chicago is landfill. But I think that in some ways, one geography is taken for granted. The landfill is assumed to be natural. In another place, it's not. So in some ways, I'm asking you, Chris, is that what you bring as a Caribbean artist to a geography like Lake Michigan that's seen as, again, continental, terra firma, solid ground taken for granted? And then on the other side, there's this question of the sea that's come up a number of times, that we need to animate the sea as a vibrant space that is full of both fisher folk and drug traffickers, but also deep water rigs, migrant boats, right? And not just migrants from the Caribbean to the US, but also what we've seen recently where Coast Guards are finding boats of African migrants who are attempting to reach the Canary Islands in Europe that are washing up in places like Curacao and Barbados. So I was wondering if these are two ways, the sea and the shoreline, that we unsettle the way that certain kinds of geographies, particularly continental geographies, are taken for granted in ways that we can never take for granted in the Caribbean. So I'd love all of your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you bring up Guyana, because when I started doing a lot of work in Suriname, I felt a tremendous anxiety of being landlocked, but then it was a misnomer, because in a way, the assumption is that land is static. And there are a lot of artists in the sort of early sort of protagonists of conceptual work in Trinidad, for example, that talk about sort of juxtapositioning geological time and sort of human time. We can understand the concept of water's fluidity, but we still struggle with the concept of land's fluidity, because it's kind of happening in another kind of unfathomable way. So and I think that and it's interesting you bring up Guyana again, because it's like one of those places that sits between the continent and the kind of the two oceans, right? Or the one ocean that takes us to Asia, to Africa, and to some degree now in more current times to North America and Central America and so on. So I think that's a pretty So I think when I found myself walking on Lake Michigan, it's it's a number of things, because at an earlier stage of my life, the shoreline was like the place where I was trapped. There's a really fascinating early poem by Walcott where he talks about being seen by blue eyes through binoculars. He's on the shore and the boat is out there. But I think it also makes you think that how does the world look from this vantage point as well? So it's almost like I'm looking back, and so walking on Lake Michigan transports me, to all shorelines in some kind of way, or it becomes a site where my kind of experience, turns into a constellation of ideas looking outward. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys. Yeah.
I love, Teresita's, your analysis on Plato's cave and how you stand sort of in the space in between. And I'm wondering, I hear all of you having a sort of a very keen sense of belonging, and how that sort of sense of fate within your history, how that mixes with being in that middle ground space, and what does that middle ground relate to your own sense of belonging to the Caribbean. And Magda, you talk about having to perform Caribbean, but at the same time, it's where you come from, and it's what defines you. It's your culture, is where you belong in a way. So I wonder how you play with these sort of sides of the cave and that in between.
I don't know if when Teresita was just referring to in between, she was maybe thinking too of Homi Baba say about the translation of culture, in which is this negotiation. And what I also think myself, not only of a space in between, but a space of limbo. The condition of limbo, it could be, for instance, anybody right now from the Caribbean in in a borderline to arrive to America, or anybody in the ocean trying to arrive to a shore in America. But also, I think that too as a condition that is a ontological as well. How us people that were born in the geography of the Caribbean, with the condition of and I say geological, the geography of that location, latitude, longitude, equatorial line, above, below, all of those implications, and how do we have construct economically and politically our small planet. But because those conditions are no detour from economical, philosophical, and ultimately condition of power, and how power and access to it is distributed and permitted. Who have the power? When I come back to describe the canon and to think about, just mention briefly, what would be to perform Europeanness? No, I don't think that that's had been questioned before or put out in those terms. But do I, a woman that born in a small town in Matanzas, could question and propose that I'm going to consider some conditions of expectations coming upon me from people in other geography could be settled as their performativity of a vision of me. No, so, and I want to be clear in this, I feel myself sometimes in a limbo, no in between, in a limbo. I love this new piece of Teresita Fernandez. Is a moment of buoyancy. It's a moment of lifting out of the ground and be suspended too in a condition. But it's not my choice and it's not my definition. I am fighting very hard to rewrite from within how I want to be seen, understood, accepted, and be part of. The division and the perception of the Caribbean and elsewhere is not my invention. It's an invasion of hold power and to hold control in every sphere, economical, political, philosophical, and even artistic. And we were talking about abstraction. I was thinking in a small group of people in Cuba, the group of 11, in the middle of Havana, Raúl let me see, did I get it right? Gonzalez? Or Nena, help me from the audience if you, did I have the name wrong? Antonio Vidal, Fayad Yamid, all these individuals come with a vision of abstraction that is absolutely Caribbean. What could be the definition of abstraction belonging to a geography and no other? It's almost like say that the entity of soul that we may have in some place between the heart cavity and the stomach place maybe is only possible or available for people of certain place. There is lack of language. There is lack of definition. There is lack of metaphor that really embrace and could construct to speak about where I come from. But where I come from is not different in so many ways of where I am standing. I am talking to you from Nashville, and my Caribbeanness have no shift, have no diminishing, have no hide. I am all those things in all those places. That's what my Caribbeanness is. Me in Matanzas, me in New York, me in Padua, me in Dakar, me in Lagos, and me in Nashville. That's what I'm trying to define. That's what I'm fighting for. That's for what is no language built by anybody that define me yet. I am building that language. I am constructing that as we speak at this moment with you two. That's what I'm thinking. That is the conversation. We are, because we are still talking and trying to define all of us with the language of a very, very construct and subjugated historical power.
Magda, I feel the same way about your work, but also to listen to you is just so powerful. You are in this room more than any of us. I wanted to just add, like, I agree with everything that you're saying. So I identify with it so much, and I was reminded of a piece written by George Lamming, who I think is such an important person, such an important thinker, called Isla Incognita, where he tries to define for us, you know, what the Caribbean is, and his answer is basically the only way. I think he's describing islands, not Caribbeanness, islands. You know, how do you describe an? How do you define an island? And he arrives at the conclusion that the only way that he could describe what an island is that it's the opposite of what the colonizers did, and it does this very sophisticated thing, which is it says what it's not without fixing it to what it is. And I think that's such a powerful proposition that in even within this exhibition, I think there's such a generosity of not naming the thing, not fixing it into one definition, but allowing it to sort of throw you back into this unknown, right? I often think of the night sky. I often use images of the night sky in my work, because it's so powerful to me that when we look at constellations, when we look at stars, it's, I think, the only place that we imagine that lives inside of us without any colonial language attached to it. It's the only place that we actually imagine without the burden of all of the internalized colonial structures that we all have to negotiate constantly within us. Yeah.
It's interesting in this sort of conversation around, there's something that kind of worried me in the conversation about performativity, is that I think that the generations that dealt with that more solidly, more aggressively, were those that lived in that kind of colonial moment when the prospect of sovereignty hadn't really entered the conversation very aggressively. So it wasn't so much that it was a kind of way in which this thing that they were performing gave them on the opposite side a sanctuary to imagine. Yeah. So it became like a kind of a mask for exchange. And I think what's really interesting about projects, the amount of Caribbean shows that have manifested in the last couple of years, is that we're sort of hanging in the balance between a kind of moment in which when the sort of requirement of performativity is removed from that kind of past spatial possibility that's being eroded, then we're in a very funny mood, a very funny position in terms of how we can proceed to move forward or to get on with the business of being. Because we've had a longer history of this requirement. Many Caribbean states have only become sovereign, in the last, 60 years. Different revolutions. Yes, it's true. In Haiti, that prospect began a very long time ago. But then, of course, the pressures of the hemisphere and the world fell upon them to kind of undermine that journey. So they keep going back to the same point. So it's very interesting, this moment in my mind. So I just wanted to kind of clear that up, because it almost sounded like I was dismissing the moment of performativity. But that's not really my intention. It was really to kind of talk about the agency of the mask under a certain circumstance that is no longer required. So then, what do we do with ourselves? Just as a question.
So I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to do it from the online audience. The question was an anonymous one. It says, "What would you say is the future of Caribbean art?"
It's deconstruction. we have to tear it down. And I think that that's something that I'm trying to think about through this show, and it's very deliberate. It doesn't say Caribbean art. It says art in the Caribbean, which is two very different things, right? So I'm thinking more about place and locality than kind of using Caribbean as a type of descriptor for an object or an artistic practice. So that is a type of like linguistic, like an ontological move in the show that I'm trying to do. And I do think that we need to rethink these categories because all of them are problematic. All of these categories, all of these labels are Puerto Rican art, Caribbean art, American art. I mean, it goes back to your question of performing Europeanness, like European art. Like, why don't we say European art, like British art? Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, they do, the Tate does do that, but it's still problematic. I mean, it's the Tate. Yeah, but it is a question, you know, like why, is it Caribbean art? Like, I don't think I believe in that. I don't think I believe in sort of having that very particular category because it doesn't allow for so many other things, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering about your thoughts about it.
It's kind of ironic too, you know, because you know, so much of the struggles, the civil rights movement, you know, the sovereignty movements in the Caribbean were about moving from being property to subjects of crowns to man or person or human, right? But we know that that thing we were in the process of creating is what has destroyed the world we find ourselves in. It's created the Plantacenoscene or the Anthropocene and so on. So in other words, in conventional constructs, it's man, European man, that makes art. So the question is, do I want to make art? Is it useful? You know,
that's another question. That's a bigger question.
Linked to this, but it's linked to the question
but it
we're
is
asking,
linked, yeah,
you know,
of course.
maybe.
I love that, Christopher. I love that. I love
Thanks,
that
Mark.
this
Coming
last
from you,
phrase
that's
that you
meaningful.
say.
Yeah.
Do you want to make art? I would be, for the gentleman that placed the question, the future of Caribbean art, of art from the Caribbean. I am more intrigued as a maker in the future of creating this experience in what I participate in with my peers. And now we're calling art. I know that it's going to have a further definition that is not just what we're calling now. I want to say it briefly that one scene that is very vivid and important, at least for me in my own making, is the experience. And we don't define art just as, or at least the experience is just not defined as art, but is belonged in it. As somebody, and when Carla made the original question about performativity in the Caribbean, when I think about performance art today, and I teach performance arts, I do performance, and I am thinking my very, 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 very first approximation to performativity of the body is seeing ritualistic elements of it in Cuba. And the imprint of that and the presence of that never abandoned me and stayed with me forever. I have never seen a performance that transcends in experience that moment of that vivid sensorially participating in an event. So I am again here, what I am trying to articulate here is that I don't know. Is a definition of what is art may serve my purpose in his totality at this moment. I don't know.
No more questions? Then thank you so much.